It was another typical morning at the small, crowded branch of a local bank in downtown Los Angeles. The sun outside glinted off the glass buildings, casting reflections onto the pavement as people hustled along, eager to get their errands done. Inside, the air was filled with the soft murmur of voices, the clicking of keyboards and the occasional sound of a printer humming. The line at the counter stretched out longer than usual that morning, and many of the people waiting looked impatient. Some checked their phones, tapping their feet or glancing around, while others stood quietly, lost in their thoughts. It was one of those mornings where nothing felt particularly special. Just a regular day for the people who came in and out of the bank, going about their business as usual. At the front of the line, there was an elderly woman. She had light gray hair pulled into a neat bun, a face marked by age and experience. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and she seemed to be having some trouble with the steps involved in withdrawing cash. The woman, who appeared to be in her late 70s, was holding her purse tightly to her side, as if it was the only thing she had left in the world. Despite her frailty, she carried herself with a quiet dignity, but there was an unease in her eyes as she approached the counter. She had been standing in line for some time now, but when she finally reached the teller, something went wrong. The teller, a young woman in her 20s, typed away on her keyboard, scanning the woman's name and checking her information against the bank's records. After a few moments, her face dropped slightly, and she glanced at the woman with a frustrated look. "I'm sorry, but it seems like your ID isn't coming up in the system," the teller said, her voice a little too loud. The words felt sharp in the otherwise quiet room. The elderly woman blinked, not quite understanding. "I'm sure I've used it here before," she said gently, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is there something wrong with it?" The teller didn't answer right away. She frowned as she typed furiously on her keyboard, tapping and clicking in rapid succession. The woman waited, hoping the problem would be solved quickly, but the teller only seemed more flustered. Finally, after a long moment of awkward silence, the teller sighed and shook her head. "I'm afraid it's not showing up here," she said, her voice almost dismissive. "You'll have to check with the customer service desk." The elderly woman's face flushed, her hand gripping her purse a little tighter. Her eyes darted around the bank as if searching for something, anything to make this situation less embarrassing. She was keenly aware of the other customers now looking at her, some of them whispering among themselves. I don't understand," the woman stammered. "I've been a customer here for years." "Why isn't it working now?" A few people in the line behind her shifted impatiently, tapping their feet and checking their watches. Some of them exchanged glances, barely able to hide their impatience. The teller didn't seem to notice, or maybe she just didn't care. She gave the elderly woman a look that could only be described as frustrated, and then turned to one of her coworkers at the nearby desk. "Hey, can you help with this one?" she asked, her tone a little too loud. The coworker nodded but didn't move right away. He seemed busy with something else, and the elderly woman was left standing there, increasingly uncomfortable, with everyone in the line watching her. A cold chill ran down her spine as she realized just how vulnerable she felt in that moment. The elderly woman who had worked her entire life, had done everything by the book, now felt small and invisible in a sea of judgmental eyes. She wasn't even sure what had gone wrong. Maybe her ID was out of date, or maybe there was some mistake. The moments felt like they stretched on for an eternity. She shuffled a little on her feet, trying to steady herself, but the tension in the room kept growing. Each second that passed seemed to drag her further into a pit of humiliation. The manager, a middle-aged man with a neatly combed hair, approached, but instead of offering help, he glanced briefly at the teller and then turned his gaze to the elderly woman. "I'm afraid you'll need to step aside," he said, his voice matter-of-fact, not unkind but not warm either. "We have other customers waiting." The elderly woman's face fell as she nodded, silently stepping aside and moving toward a nearby chair. She sat down slowly, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse tighter. The line was still long, and though the people behind her had returned to their phones or their thoughts, she could feel their stares like hot coals on her back. She was just another face in a sea of anonymous people now, a frail figure who didn't belong in the bright, cold, and impersonal atmosphere of the bank. But what hurt the most was not the frustration of the teller or the indifference of the manager. It was the feeling that the world had passed her by, that she was invisible to everyone around her. All she wanted was to get her money, to take care of the small things in life that still mattered. Yet here she was, treated as though she were some kind of inconvenience. It was a crushing feeling. The elderly woman hadn't planned for this. She hadn't prepared for the way her heart would race, the way her face would flush with shame, or the way her dignity would slowly slip away as she sat there in that corner of the bank. But there she was, the faint sound of voices echoing in her ears as the world moved on without her. Some people in the line looked away, their eyes avoiding the uncomfortable scene. Others were still watching, but with judgment now written across their faces. One man smirked as he glanced over. Another rolled his eyes as if waiting for the elderly woman to hurry up and leave. She didn't know how long she sat there, trying to regain some sense of composure, feeling like an outsider in a place that should have felt safe and normal. And then, just as she was about to rise to her feet and leave the bank, the unexpected happened. The elderly woman sat in silence, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the situation. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how unfair it all seemed. She had always taken care of her finances. She had been independent for years, managing her small pension and bills with a steady hand. But now here she was, feeling utterly humiliated in front of a crowd of strangers who seemed to think she was the one causing a problem. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the heat of embarrassment spreading across her face. She wanted to leave, to disappear from this place and never come back, but she also knew that she had to resolve this issue somehow. She had bills to pay, and the thought of going back home empty-handed felt like another blow. As she looked around, her eyes caught the figure of the bank manager who had spoken to her earlier. He was standing behind the counter now, talking to a group of younger employees, but his gaze occasionally flickered toward her. It wasn't a glance of concern, though. It was more like a quick, dismissive look, as though he had already moved on to something more important. She tried to sit up a little straighter, to regain some of her old pride, but the weight of the situation still hung heavily in the air. The room felt even colder now, the hum of the air conditioning above her seeming louder than ever. The long line at the counter was still moving slowly, but she could feel the tension in the room mounting. Each time someone in line glanced her way, she felt smaller and smaller. She just wanted to shrink into the chair and fade into the background. It wasn't long before the teller who had helped her earlier returned to the counter. She was talking to another customer now, but her eyes flickered toward the elderly woman again. The young woman seemed to hesitate for a moment, perhaps unsure of what to do next. The elderly woman caught the glance and looked away quickly, afraid that if she made eye contact again, she might lose what little dignity she had left. Suddenly, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind her. It was strange because she hadn't heard anyone move in her direction. She looked up, startled, and there, standing just a few feet away from her, was a man who seemed completely out of place in the middle of the bank. He wasn't wearing a suit or anything particularly formal. In fact, he was dressed casually in a simple t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap. His sunglasses were perched on top of his head, and he had a relaxed, easygoing manner about him. But there was something about him that stood out, a presence that was hard to ignore. The man seemed to notice her at the same time she noticed him. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she felt something stir inside her, a kind of warmth, a flicker of hope. He gave her a small smile, the kind of smile that seemed to say, "I see you," in a way that no one else had in what felt like forever. The elderly woman blinked in surprise, unsure of what to make of this stranger. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently, his voice calm and kind. She hesitated, feeling a little embarrassed to speak. But there was something in his tone that made her feel as though she could trust him, even though she didn't know him. "I'm not sure," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to withdraw some money, but there seems to be a problem with my ID. They asked me to step aside." The man's brow furrowed in concern, and he glanced over at the teller who was still busy with her other customers. He seemed to take a quick assessment of the situation, then turned back to her with a reassuring nod. "It's okay," he said softly. "Sometimes these things happen. Let me see if I can help." The elderly woman blinked again, not sure if she had heard him correctly. You want to help me?" The man smiled again, this time with a little more warmth. "Of course. It's no trouble." Before she could respond, the man turned toward the counter and approached the teller. He spoke quietly to her, but the elderly woman couldn't quite hear what was being said. The teller glanced over at the woman sitting in the corner, then looked back at the man, her expression changing from indifference to confusion. There was a brief pause, and the man seemed to explain something to her. The teller nodded, though her discomfort was obvious. The elderly woman sat still, watching the interaction unfold. She didn't know who this man was, or why he was stepping in to help her. But somehow in that moment she felt a little less alone. His calm demeanor was a sharp contrast to the cold professionalism of the bank staff. The man returned to her side, his face now soft with understanding. "They'll take care of it," he said with a gentle smile. "You don't need to worry about a thing." She wasn't sure why, but tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. Maybe it was because no one had spoken to her like that in a long time. With patience, with kindness. It wasn't just the fact that he had stepped in to help, but the way he had done it. It was like he saw her as a person, not just another customer. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. The man gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before walking back toward the counter. The elderly woman watched him as he disappeared into the crowd, feeling an odd mix of gratitude and confusion. She hadn't expected help, much less from a stranger, but now that it had happened, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It was as though for a brief moment the world had seen her, really seen her, and it had made all the difference. The bank staff, still distracted with their work, hadn't noticed the quiet exchange between the man and the elderly woman. They didn't know who he was, and frankly, they didn't seem to care. But to the woman sitting in the corner, it didn't matter. In that brief interaction, she had experienced something rare. Someone had cared enough to step in when everyone else was too busy to notice. She wiped the tears from her eyes, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She felt lighter, a little less small, a little less invisible. It wasn't the money she had come for that day. It was something much more important, her dignity, her sense of being seen. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the man disappeared out the door, leaving behind only the faintest echo of his presence. The elderly woman took a deep breath and stood up slowly. The tension in her shoulders had lessened, and the weight in her chest had lifted, if only slightly. She glanced toward the counter again, her heart still racing from the kindness of a stranger. For the first time that day, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. The elderly woman sat back down in her chair, her hands still trembling a little, but this time from something different. There was a faint sense of hope stirring inside her. The feeling was unfamiliar but welcome. The man had disappeared so quickly and she had no idea who he was, but his kindness had left a mark on her. It had been a long time since anyone had taken the time to truly see her. The world around her had often felt like it was moving on without her. But for a brief moment it had stopped and she had been part of it. As she looked around the bank again, the feeling of being invisible started to lift. The staff, though still going about their work, seemed a little less cold now. She wasn't sure why, but it was as if that small interaction had somehow shifted the energy in the room. The teller, who had been so dismissive earlier, now seemed to be more aware of the elderly woman sitting in the corner, her eyes flickering over every so often. But the elderly woman didn't care about their stares anymore. She had already decided that she wasn't going to let herself be treated like an inconvenience. It wasn't the money that mattered anymore, but how she was treated, with respect, with patience, and with a little bit of humanity. Minutes passed, and the line at the counter began to dwindle. A few more customers were helped, and soon, the bank was quieter than it had been when she first walked in. It was as though the world had calmed down a little, and she was no longer just part of the background noise. The manager, who had been standing behind the counter earlier, now walked over to the customer service desk, his expression serious. The elderly woman watched him go, feeling a small pang of frustration. He had been the one to tell her to step aside earlier, but now it seemed as though he had forgotten all about her. His brisk movements, the way he was always hurrying from one task to the next, reminded her of how often people in her life had brushed past her. But just as she was starting to feel that old sense of frustration creep back in, she heard a voice. "Ma'am?" The voice was soft but clear. She turned, startled, and found herself looking up at the teller who had first helped her. The young woman was standing a few feet away, her posture now less rigid, a look of hesitation on her face. "I'm really sorry about earlier," the teller said, her voice more sincere than before. There was a problem with the system, but it's all fixed now. Your ID is good to go. The elderly woman blinked, unsure of what to say. She had not expected an apology, let alone an explanation. The teller seemed genuinely apologetic, her earlier dismissiveness replaced with something more human, a quiet sense of regret. "Thank you," the elderly woman said softly, her voice a little hoarse from the emotions that had stirred inside her. I didn't know what was happening. It all happened so fast." "I understand," the teller nodded. "It's frustrating when things go wrong, especially when you don't know why. I just wanted to make sure everything was resolved." The elderly woman's heart warmed at the kindness in the teller's voice. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her feel like a person again. "Not just a problem to be dealt with, I appreciate it," the elderly woman said, her words coming more easily now. The teller smiled, and for the first time, the elderly woman noticed a slight hint of warmth in her eyes. "It's no problem. I'm glad it's all sorted now." With that, the teller turned and walked back toward the counter, leaving the elderly woman sitting there, feeling a little lighter. The apology, simple as it was, meant more to her than she could put into words. It reminded her that people could change, that even in places like this there was room for compassion. The elderly woman took a deep breath and stood up again, this time more confidently. She walked slowly to the counter, her hand still gripping her purse but with a steadier gait than before. She approached the teller who had apologized and stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. "I'm ready now," she said, her voice stronger this time. The teller smiled at her and motioned for her to step forward. "Of course. Let's get this sorted out for you." As the elderly woman handed over her card, she felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't just the money she was withdrawing that mattered anymore, but the way she was being treated. It felt like a small victory, one that was about more than just paperwork or systems. It was about being seen, about having her dignity restored even in a small way. The teller processed the transaction quickly, and within minutes, the elderly woman had the money she needed. She didn't rush to leave this time. She stood there for a moment, taking it all in. There was still a part of her that felt vulnerable, unsure of how the world would treat her next. But there was another part of her that was starting to believe that maybe people weren't as indifferent as they sometimes seemed. "Thank you again," she said, turning back to the teller with a genuine smile. The teller nodded. "No problem at all. Take care." With a final nod, the elderly woman walked slowly toward the door. As she passed through the security gates and out onto the sidewalk, she paused for a moment, taking in the fresh air. It felt like a different day than the one she had walked into the bank just an hour ago. There was still a long road ahead, but she didn't feel quite so alone anymore. The kindness of the stranger in the bank, the quiet apology from the teller, had made her feel more human than she had in a long time. It reminded her that the world was full of small moments of connection, even in places where it might seem like no one noticed. As she walked down the street, the sun shining on her face, she couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, things were changing. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't just someone who had been forgotten. There was still kindness in the world, still a chance for people to care, and that, she realized, was enough. As the elderly woman stepped out of the bank and into the busy streets of downtown Los Angeles, the noise of the city felt both distant and close. The traffic, the honking cars, the murmuring of people all blended into a background hum. For a moment she just stood there, looking out over the busy street. It was hard to describe what she felt. Part of her wanted to keep walking, to get as far away from the awkwardness of the bank as possible. But another part of her, the part that had started to feel a little lighter, wanted to linger just a little longer, to take in this moment of peace. The small victory in the bank wasn't just about the money. It wasn't even about the transaction being completed. It was about the kindness she had received, and how it had reminded her that she still mattered. Even in a world that often seemed to rush past her, there were still moments when people stopped, when they took the time to care. That feeling was rare, but it was more powerful than anything she had expected. With a deep breath, she began walking slowly down the sidewalk, her steps measured and deliberate. Her heart was still racing a little, not from fear or discomfort, but from the strange mix of emotions that had taken hold of her that day. She wasn't sure what had changed in her. Perhaps it was the kindness of the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, or the unexpected apology from the teller. Or maybe it was the realization that there was more to life than just being another face in the crowd. She walked past cafes and shops, the hustle and bustle of the city surrounding her, but somehow it felt less overwhelming now. She had always felt like she was on the outside looking in, like the world had passed her by. But today, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was part of it, like she had just been reminded that even small acts of kindness could make a difference. As she walked, her mind wandered back to the man who had helped her earlier. He had appeared out of nowhere, offering her help without hesitation. She didn't know who he was or why he had stepped in, but it didn't matter. His actions had shown her something important, that people could still surprise you, that there was goodness in the world, even when you least expected it. She wondered if he had any idea how much his simple act of kindness had meant. Maybe it was just another day for him, just another moment where he saw someone in need and stepped in, but to her it had felt like something more. He had seen her, truly seen her, and had treated her with the respect and care that she had almost forgotten she deserved. She shook her head, as if trying to shake off the thought. There was no need to dwell on it. What mattered was that she had experienced that kindness, and it had helped her more than she could explain. The elderly woman's step slowed as she approached the corner, and she paused for a moment to take in the view. The street stretched out before her, the city unfolding in all directions. For a brief moment she felt a wave of gratitude. Maybe life wasn't always easy, and maybe the world didn't always treat people fairly, but there were still moments, rare moments where everything felt right. Just then, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned her head, half expecting to see someone hurrying past, but instead, there he was again, the man from the bank. He was walking at a leisurely pace, not in a rush at all. He had a relaxed, almost carefree attitude, and he looked over at her with a friendly smile. The moment their eyes met, she couldn't help but feel a warmth spread through her chest. "I didn't expect to see you out here," the man said, his voice light and friendly. "I thought you were heading in the other direction." The elderly woman smiled, a little surprised to see him again. "I didn't expect to see you either," she replied, her voice warmer than before. "But I'm glad I did." The man chuckled lightly. "Well, I guess we're both in the same place at the same time." They stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. The city around them was busy, but in that small corner of the world, it felt like everything had slowed down. It wasn't often that a chance encounter turned into something more, but in this moment it felt right. "I wanted to thank you," the elderly woman said, breaking the silence, "for what you did back at the bank. I don't know why you stepped in, but I'm grateful." The man shrugged, his expression humble. "It's nothing. You looked like you needed help, and I figured it was the right thing to do." She shook her head slightly, feeling the weight of his words. It was so simple yet so profound. He hadn't seen her as an inconvenience, hadn't brushed her off. He had just seen someone who needed help and had offered it without hesitation. "Still, it meant a lot," she said softly. The man smiled. "I'm glad to hear that. Sometimes we all need a little kindness. You never know when it's going to make a difference." The elderly woman nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle in her heart. She had spent so much of her life feeling invisible, like no one cared. But in that moment, she realized that the world was full of people who cared. They were just harder to find than she had thought. They stood there for a few more moments, both of them looking at the busy city around them. For the elderly woman, it was a peaceful silence, the kind that comes from understanding without needing words. There was no rush, no pressure. Just two people caught in the middle of their own lives, sharing a moment of connection. Eventually, the man spoke again. "Well, I'm off to run some errands. But it was nice to meet you. I hope the rest of your day goes better." The elderly woman smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. "Thank you. I hope you have a good day, too." And with that, the man gave her a small nod and turned to walk down the street. She watched him for a moment, feeling the warmth of his kindness linger. Then with a deep breath, she turned and continued on her own way. The world was still bustling around her, but she didn't feel as small as she once had. She felt, for the first time in a long while, that she mattered. As she walked, the city seemed a little less overwhelming, the noise a little less intrusive. There was still so much to deal with in life, so many challenges ahead, but now in this moment she felt something different. The world hadn't forgotten her, and maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. The days after the incident at the bank felt different for the elderly woman. There was a quiet change that had taken place inside her. She found herself walking down the streets of her neighborhood with a lighter step, more aware of the small moments of beauty that had once gone unnoticed. The laughter of children playing in the park, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner, the way the sunlight flickered through the trees in the late afternoon. All of it seemed brighter somehow, more alive. She didn't know exactly what had shifted. Maybe it was the kindness she had received from a stranger, or the way the teller had taken the time to apologize. But whatever it was, it had helped her see the world differently. She wasn't invisible anymore, or at least not in the way she used to feel. People had a way of surprising her, of showing kindness when she least expected it. It was like a little spark of light had been reignited in her heart, and it was warming everything around her. The elderly woman didn't share much of this with anyone. She kept it to herself, but it was there just beneath the surface. She was more mindful of her surroundings now, more aware of the people around her. It wasn't about looking for validation, but about seeing others in the same way she had been seen. As human beings with stories, with struggles, with the same hopes and fears that everyone carried. It made her feel less alone, more connected to the world. One afternoon, a week after the bank encounter, she was sitting on a bench in the park, watching the children play. The sun was warm, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees. It was peaceful, and for a moment the woman allowed herself to just be. She closed her eyes, taking in the sounds of the park, the distant chatter of families, the squeals of children running around, and the occasional bark of a dog. It was all so simple yet so perfect. When she opened her eyes, her gaze wandered to the corner of the park, where an elderly man was sitting alone on another bench. He looked familiar, but she couldn't place where she had seen him before. He was hunched slightly, with gray hair and a weathered face. He seemed to be watching the children too, but there was something in his expression that seemed distant, as though he was lost in thought. The elderly woman felt a strange tug in her chest. She had been alone for a long time, and she knew how easy it was to feel invisible. Maybe he was feeling the same way. It wasn't easy to approach someone, especially a stranger, but something about him made her want to reach out, to share some of the kindness she had received. With a deep breath, she stood up and walked over to him. Her legs were a little stiff, but she moved with determination. As she approached the bench, she hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, but then she simply smiled, offering a friendly nod. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, her voice gentle. The elderly man looked up, startled at first, but then a small smile spread across his face.
"Not at all," he replied, his voice a little raspy.
"It's a nice day, isn't it?" "It is," she agreed, sitting down next to him. She glanced at the children running in the distance, the laughter echoing in the air. "They remind me of when my own children were young. It feels like it was so long ago." The man chuckled softly. "I know what you mean. Time has a way of slipping by when you're not paying attention." They both fell silent for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. The woman could sense that the man was thinking about his own life, perhaps the people he had loved and lost along the way. She didn't know his story, but she could feel that there was a shared understanding between them. Loneliness had a way of bringing people together even when they didn't speak. "So, what brings you out to the park today?" she asked, breaking the silence. The man turned to her, a twinkle in his eyes. "Just needed a change of scenery, I suppose. The world can feel a little heavy sometimes, and a little fresh air does wonders." "I understand that," she said, nodding. "I've been thinking about how much little things can make a difference. Like today, I wasn't sure if I should come out, but something about the sun and the breeze. It just felt right." He smiled at her, a knowing look in his eyes. "Sometimes that's all you need. Just a bit of peace to remind you that things can be good." The elderly woman nodded, feeling the weight of his words. It was true. Life wasn't always easy, but it had a way of offering small moments of beauty, if only you were willing to see them. The kindness from the bank had shown her that, and now, sitting here in the park, she was starting to believe that there was always room for more. They continued to talk for a while, the conversation flowing easily between them. The man shared stories of his own life, the places he had been, the people he had loved. The elderly woman listened, nodding and adding her own memories, her own thoughts. They didn't talk about anything particularly profound, but that didn't matter. It was the connection that counted. As the afternoon wore on, the park began to quiet down. The children had all gone home, and the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the grass. The elderly woman stood up, stretching her legs. Well, I should probably be getting home, she said, smiling at the man, but it was nice talking to you. The man stood as well, his expression thoughtful. It was nice talking to you too. It's funny how you can meet someone and feel like you've known them forever. She smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Maybe we've just been waiting for the right moment. They shared one last smile before the woman turned and began walking back toward her apartment. The streets felt quieter now, the evening settling in. The small encounters, the little moments, had begun to weave together into something more meaningful. The elderly woman didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer invisible. The kindness she had received, the unexpected connections she had made, had opened her eyes to the world in a way she had never imagined. Life wasn't always easy, but it was still beautiful. As she walked home, she looked up at the sky, the stars beginning to twinkle in the deepening night. She felt at peace, as if the world had given her exactly what she needed. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic changes. It was the small, quiet moments of connection, the simple acts of kindness that had changed everything. And for the first time in a long time, she was okay with that.